Why don't we get started? Welcome everybody to the fourth and final author webinar as part of the PJ Library webinar series. The first three were amazing and we're excited for today's webinar. Between the lines, Midrash is inspiration for children's books. And we're so excited today to introduce to you three amazing and resourceful people who will help us talk about Midrash and how it inspired them and the process of writing their books. And we'll also be talking to an expert on Midrash, if we can go to the next slide. So a lot of people have asked us over the years, mainly because there are many PJ Library and PJ Arway books that have some Midrashic background in them. And there are certainly a lot of Jewish books that do. But authors today really want to know how to access these stories. And so when I introduce Sara, she'll be talking more about this. But I just want to give a sense of what do we mean by Midrash? And Sarah's going to give a much better definition. But when we talk about Midrash, we talk about basically like 1,000 years worth of ancient interpretation of biblical text that includes rich and often disturbing, often joyous, often celebratory stories that very much veer away from the original text of Tanakh and Torah and biblical text and really create a life unto itself. And so we thought that the perfect people to speak about Midrash and stories today are Steve Sheinkin, who is the author, illustrator of the Rabbi Harvey graphic novel series and very popular books that are in PJ Arway. And the basis of the Rabbi Harvey series are Midrashic and Talmudic stories, dilemmas, conundrums, stories. So he'll talk about that process today. Mat Tonti, who is the author of the Book of Secrets, a graphic novel that also interweaves not just Midrash, but also later Jewish legends. And he'll talk about the process of writing that story and hopefully shed some light for other authors on how that process worked. And finally, we're going to be talking with Sara Wolkenfeld, who's the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria, an amazing scholar in her own right. She is part of an amazing resource that we all use, and we hope that you as authors will have an introduction today to help you use this amazing online resource that provides basically almost any Talmudic, Midrashic paragraph, story, section, both in the original Aramaic or Hebrew and also in English translation. And it's incredibly engaging. And once you get a sense of how to use it, it can become a tremendous resource. And we're really proud, PJ Library is really proud to be partnering with Sefaria. And so you'll be seeing more of Sara and more of Sefaria as you start to think about stories, because Sefaria and Sara have also offered their services in terms of helping authors find these stories. So why don't we start with Steve? Steve, can you introduce yourself? And we can go to the next slide that shows the books that Steve and Matt have offered.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm Steve Sheinkin, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit about my Rabbi Harvey books and answer questions. I'll show some pictures too from the process. But yeah, just an overview. Okay, the idea is very strange, which is a good thing and a bad thing when you're trying to sell a new book. But it's a comics about a rabbi in the Wild West. So just that pitch line alone will get you rejected from just about every publisher. And it took a long time. We can talk about how to try to sell a story like that. It's easier now than it was 20 years ago, I think. But yeah, so where did this idea come from? Let me just start there, and I'm going to share my screen if I'm allowed to do so. See if it works. Okay, I'm going to try to go to my PowerPoint if they let me. And just talk a little bit about where the idea came from. It's not seeming to allow me right now to do that. So forget it for now.
Well, what we can do is let's introduce Matt and Sara as well, and then we'll get deeper.
Yeah, good idea. Good idea.
You tell us a little bit about your background just as an author, and then we'll get deeper into Rabbi Harvey.
Yeah, well, what are you seeing now? I mean, is it frozen? My computer seems
it says you started screen sharing, but we're going to get more screen sharing anyway, so it'll be.
All right, yeah. So this goes way back. So I always wanted to be a writer, and I always loved drawing comics. I don't particularly think I'm a good artist, but I just always loved doodling and sketching and things like that. And so, but the idea for Rabbi Harvey, it's true, it's rooted in old Jewish wisdom and tales, but I never set out to study that sort of thing. I'm certainly the least scholar and expert on this panel here today. What happened was, when I was in Hebrew school, my father, he could tell, like, he was very serious. He wanted me to study and learn everything I needed to know, but I think he could tell I wasn't getting too much out of it other than memorization. And he started giving me books of Jewish folk tales. And I didn't realize that I was learning Jewish wisdom from them. I just thought, well, these are great stories. And what I loved in particular were stories where humble people outwitted bad guys, which is a common theme in these stories. And they're using Talmudic wisdom and things that I didn't even know about at the time. And those stories, which were in books, of course, in those days, were very influential to me. At the time, I didn't really think about, well, I'm going to do something with these. It was just, this is where I got a huge part of my education in terms of Jewish wisdom from. And the beauty of it was I didn't know I was learning anything, which for me, for the type of kid I was the key to why I learned it. And it was only years later when I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be a filmmaker, I was trying lots of different ways to do all that sort of thing, that I came back to these stories and had the idea of creating a comic using the stories and putting my own twist on them. I always think that, you come to the end of a story, I'm sure everyone has this experience with a book they're reading, and you just wish it would keep going. And that's,
I think everybody agrees with that in terms of Rabbi Harvey, as you know.
Oh yeah. Well, it was, yeah, I mean, it was such a fun process. We'll talk more about this. It's going back and refinding these stories that influenced me so much and reading them, taking notes on them, and then trying to figure out how to put my own twist, how to retell them in my own way. And so I think that's a good introduction to what I was trying to do with the Harvey books. And I'm sorry about the weird screen sharing thing. Right now, my computer's kind of frozen, so I'm hoping you guys can still see me. And
we see you, and you're speaking really smoothly. And we'll try to figure out the screen screen sharing part. But thank you for sharing that part of your process. And I also was just wondering, and I think that authors may want to know this too. So when you first got interested in writing books that would be based on these stories, what books did you turn to?
Oh man, I wish I could show you the picture that I have on my screen. Does anyone, now this is going to depend on when you grew up, I guess, but my dad, the first one he gave me, I still remember it. It was called 101 Jewish Stories. And it looks like the most boring book you'll ever pick up. It's just a terrible cover, no art, nothing. It looked like someone photocopied it.
Unfortunately, now Steve is frozen. Can people still hear me? So we'll get back to Steve, and hopefully we can share, we can find a link and ask Steve to share that with all of you. In the meantime, why don't we go over to Matt? And Matt, same question to you. What was your process with first of all, can you introduce yourself a bit? Sure. And tell us about your process in writing the Book of Secrets?
Sure. So, hello everybody. My name is Mat Tonti, and I am the illustrator and writer of the Book of Secrets, which is a book of Midrash turned into comics. And also very similar to Steve, I grew up doodling comics, Calvin and Hobbes, Superman, X-Men, all that stuff. As I, there's the Jewish journey, which, ideally we're all on. And around, when I was 25 and kind of getting more into observance and more into kind of learning more about what it means to be Jewish as an adult, I started learning more of the stories, which I'd always heard my rabbi growing up had all the once upon a time there was a king, and then a story followed. And so when I first started hearing these stories, it was my natural inclination to I was like, oh, I can totally see that. And I would draw them. The first one was Nachshon's Leap, which was like a 3-page comic. And the Midrash is Nachshon ben Aminadav, who is the first person to go into the Yam Suf, the Red Sea. And he goes, the Midrash is he goes up to his knees and then to his waist. It still hasn't split. He goes up to his chest. It doesn't split. He goes up until he has like one nostril above the water, and that's when the sea split, right? And it's a great metaphor for taking chances and kind of pushing past your own boundaries. And I was like, I got to draw it. I couldn't not draw it, so I did. And it went on like that. And the more I read stories, the more I would develop them. And I always loved characters. I used to sign when I was in first grade, I would sign my papers with the head of Snoopy. I would just draw Snoopy's head, and my teacher knew that was me. Like I've always been I've been drawn to drawing characters. Opus from Bloom County. And so when I finally found the Dough-lem, or when the Dough-lem found me, which is one of the characters in the book, I was like, one day, somehow, I'm going to get this Dough-lem either animated or into a book, some sort of get a context. And so when I thought about doing these stories, I originally did a story of the Tainted Grain, which is a Rabbi Nachman story. And that was in 2013. And I was like, this is good enough. I was like, this is good. This I can build on. And so from there, from that story, I had no idea about the frame story. I had no idea about the characters. I just knew that we had the Dough-lem carrying a sack of flour in its bag, which I had no idea there was flour in there, and met a king. And once upon a time, there was a king, and that was the first thing. And from there, I actually called Stephen and said, how do I get published, and who do I talk to? And he helped me get on that journey. So, and you asked if it's okay. Just you asked about.
Wait, also just before you go on. You called Steve Sheinkin.
I did, yeah.
Okay, so Steve, we're going to come back to you to ask you what advice Matt. So we're going to get to you in a second. So well, Matt, tell us.
Well, if you want to do influences, or is that enough in an intro? You let me know.
Go ahead. Keep with your intro. I like it.
All right. So I'll just say, so where did I find stories? That's one question. So part of it, I'll just show you one amazing volume. Before it was all digitized, the Book of Legends, which was by Chaim Bialik, Sefer Agadah, was made in order to inform the next generation of new Israelis, of the new Jew, of our literature. This is a massive, and it's all stories. It's all Midrash. So you could see, like, I went through all of these. I read every one.
Amazing.
And the ones So yeah.
I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second. I see a lot of questions coming on the chat. If you would put your questions in Q&A, we have people in the back, Tasha and Rachel and Emily, who are fielding questions so that I can get them to ask our panelists, because I can't see the chat all the time. So just go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A, then we can field them over here. So go ahead, tell us more about the Book of Legends.
Okay, so anyway, so on one hand, there was the learning of the stories. On the other hand, there was, I was like, well, are there Jewish versions of people telling stories like this? So I'll just, some of my early influences, I don't know if this is a PJ Library book, This is
It's
about
not, but it's one that we looked at for sure.
it's an amazing book, The Golem. It's about and it's this guy passed away, but this is all paper cut. And I started to see people who were like taking Jewish legends and making really amazing comics about them. Also, Will Eisner, the Contract with God trilogy. It's not necessarily about Midrash, but it is Jewish identity filtered through comics. Also, Mouse, famously, right? So, it's not just about the Midrash. It's we receive the tradition, and some people are like, what are you schlepping this on me? Like, it's making me get a bar bat mitzvah. Like this is my way of taking Jewish tradition, making it my own, and passing it to the next generation. That's really like it's a when you look at a sefer, when you look at like a traditional Jewish text, it kind of looks like this. It has like a very nice embossed. So I wanted this to be my sefer that I was going to like hand to the next generation. That's kind of
That's
the idea.
amazing. Thank you, Matt. That's
All right.
amazing. If you don't mind muting yourself, I'm going to go back to Steve for a second. If you don't mind putting the links for those books that you just talked about in the chat, so that authors on the call can also find them. If you can get those links there, that would be great. And Steve, unfortunately, we had to cut away from you. Did you want to continue just on what your inspiration was for how did you do your research? How did you find the texts for Rabbi Harvey?
Yeah, I mean, it was very low tech, not so different, but just no internet, which I guess is kind of different, because if I had something like what Sefaria does, that would be very powerful, obviously. But yeah, I may have gotten cut off earlier, but I was just talking about books. I mean, old school. So I just started, since I had been originally inspired by this book of Jewish folktales. That's what I started with, and just went to bookstores and libraries specifically for those kind of books. Whether they were written for children or adults, I didn't care. I like the adult books better just because there were more of them. And for me, I would read a 400-page book just looking for one little bit, one little idea, because I wanted all these stories. There's a lot of creative writing in them, but I wanted them all to be based on these original tales. And so none of that stuff I felt I could make up. I wanted each one to link back to an original story. And so I spent a lot of time, as the story was kind of gelling in my mind and I was figuring out what I wanted to do, just reading books after book after book of Jewish folktales and Talmudic wisdom and all this stuff that I never learned as wisdom. I just learned it as part of the process for finding stories and thinking, can this work as a comic in the Wild West? And oddly enough, just about all of it can, because there's just great stories and great little bits of wisdom. And if you're like me and you think that way, and you think, well, I'd like to add a little joke there, or just kinds of things you do as a kid. At least I think a lot of people do. When you're reading this short little folk tale, you're thinking, well, I wonder what that person would have said in that situation, or why didn't they do something? Why didn't that person say something funny there? There was such a good opportunity for a gag. And so it was a really fun experience of finding and appreciating for the first time, really, all this Jewish wisdom, but also adding my own twist to it. And I think that's what everyone who's a creator can do. And I think that's what's really beautiful about this, what you're doing, because making this material available to people, everyone would do something different with it. And that's a beautiful thing.
That's a great segue to introducing Sara. Thank you, Steve. And a couple of really good questions have come up. And I think what Steve just said actually answers one of them, which is, how do you make a story accessible to tweens, especially tween girls, when things in Midrash and things in early rabbinic literature tend to be very antagonistic, or at the very least not very feminist? How do you make that relatable to girls? But in general, how do you make these stories relatable to kids in general? And I think that one of the things that Matt and Steve did really well is, because they're also illustrators, they're able to visually, take a story from long ago and visually make it very accessible. But one of the questions that's come up, that's a really good question, is what do you do if you're not an illustrator? So I think that those are two questions to kind of guide the next part of our conversation. We asked both Matt and we asked both Matt and Steve, what were your resources? And Sarah's here to describe one of the best resources available now to people. So Sarah, could you introduce yourself and talk about Sefaria and talk about Sefaria's resources for authors?
Absolutely, thank you. So my name is Sara Wolkenfeld. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Sefaria. And so not a children's book author, but I'm really excited to harness all the creativity that's in this virtual space and invite you to find some ideas using the resources of Sefaria. And I'm going to share my screen, and this link is also available to you. These are resources you can take home and use. So let me just share my screen for a moment. Sefaria is a website that was founded in 2013 with the goal of lowering barriers to learning and making Torah freely accessible. And Catriella, you actually started the conversation talking about access and access to resources that would help people write their books. And Sefaria is all about access. That's really our founding principle. For us, access means a few different things. It means that everyone should have access, should be able to resource the tremendous wisdom that is in ancient texts. So I saw some of the questions coming in about how do I take a Midrash? How do I repurpose it? How do I take a Jewish story? Steve spoke about his book that his father gave him. You can think of this as, the digital version of that book. Also, doesn't have a lot of illustrations, so might be boring looking in a similar sense sometimes, but is actually chock full of resources that are yours to access. Sefaria believes in returning ownership of Jewish text to the Jewish people. So everything you see here is something that you can access and use and reuse. And we would like nothing better than to serve as the inspiration for the next generation of Jewish children's books. Access for us also means that as much as possible, everything is in English. So I know that there was a question that came in advance about finding these stories in a language that you can access. We'd like to have other languages also. We could talk about that another time. But as much as possible, these texts are available to you in English. And access for us also means that you can move easily between the texts and find the things that you're actually looking for. So that's a really important piece because you might have no idea where to start, or you might have some sense that there's a story, maybe a biblical story, that's always captured your imagination, or an idea in Judaism, or a symbol, a shofar, for example, or some piece of from the Jewish tradition that you feel like, well, if I just knew more about that, and if I could just research that a little bit more, then maybe I would sort of make some headway and find some great stories there. So that's really the kind of experience that Sefaria is trying to empower. We're a nonprofit. Again, we're returning Jewish texts to all of you. And I'll also just mention, in case you are someone who does your research on the go, Steve and Matt didn't speak to where these ideas struck them. And if you have to carry around a book, it's a little bit different, but Sefaria has an iOS app and an Android app. So you can really take the Torah with you wherever you go. And I want to show you, if it's okay, Catriella, I'll show two ways that you might use Sefaria to find some of these ideas, and then we can go more deeply into what some of those ideas are a little later on. So first of all, Sefaria is designed to allow you to, again, research ideas, find concepts and topics that interest you from within the Jewish tradition. So this is Sefaria's text page, and I'm going to click on more to expand it. This is our bookshelf. This is our library. This is a really, I'm going to brag a little bit and say it's a really robust library. We're really very proud of it. We've worked hard on it, but this is only helpful if you have a starting point here. And we know that most people who come to Sefaria's website are actually more interested in a thought, an idea, a question, especially when I work with children. I see that questions are really what inspire them to go deeper. This doesn't do anything for them because there are no questions here. But every Sefaria page has a search bar at the top, and you can type anything you would like into this search bar and see. Maybe it's a character. I know there are a lot of great PJ Library books about Noah, for example, and if I type in Noah, I will get the option for hashtag Noah. That's a topics page in Sefaria. And Sefaria will tell you Noah is a biblical figure, and there are both sources and sheets that are available on Sefaria about Noah. Sources just means anything from within the Jewish library. You want the biblical story of Noah. Maybe you want Midrash about Noah. Maybe you want commentaries that expand on the character of Noah. That's all here. You're getting our top rated, and of course you can keep scrolling and scrolling, you're getting our top rated sources on who Noah was and what is the Noah story. Sheets are user-generated content on Sefaria. Maybe your next story is hiding there. Maybe someone's put together an especially inspiring collection of great sources about this character, and you could take a look at that. You can always see who created the sheet. And these resources are as much a part of our library as the texts themselves. So you can open up any one of these and read it, see what's there. All of this, again, is freely reusable. It's something that you can access and something that you can learn from. So the first thing I would say is think about what you want to search in this search bar. What words you want to put in: holidays, biblical characters, ideas. I taught a class just recently about social justice, and all of those social justice categories will come up. All different kinds of social justice categories will come up if you search Sefaria. So that's Sefaria's search, and it's really a powerful tool for finding different kinds of resources. Once you find a text, let's try, in keeping with the question that you read out, Catriella, let's try a female figure. So once I find, let's say, a text about Miriam, you can open up that text, and here's where you get inside of Sefaria's library. Any text on Sefaria is interconnected with other texts. So when I click on it, you can see the sidebar, and everything that shows up in the sidebar is a resource that's connected in some way to this verse. I'm going to focus on the Midrash category since that's our focus today. When I click on Midrash, you can see we have a lot of Midrash, and hopefully you can see the little EN in a box over there. Where you see that symbol, that's a sign that we have the Midrash in English. So if it's easier for you to peruse the Midrash in English, you can do that. And you can read through it here and get a sense of, is this a story that I could tell? Is this something that I could repurpose? I thought your definition of Midrash was really helpful, Catriella, and I'll just say, by way of sort of explaining the different categories that you're seeing here on Sefaria and why there are so many, there's a lot of different Midrashim. As you said, they span a really long time. There's two basic kinds of Midrash, Midrash Halacha and Midrash Agadah. I'd say what they both have in common is that they fill in gaps. So when I speak with children, which I will tell you, in case you're wondering, that the youngest children we know of who use Sefaria fluently are in second grade. And that's because second graders can click and they can read. Those two skills don't come simultaneously for most children. They can click before they can read. So to click and to read is sometime in second grade. And children, especially at that age, are very interested in questions and filling in the gaps in the story. So any story you've ever read where you're thinking, well, what was really going on for Miriam when she took that timbrel? What was she motivated by? Why was she interested in doing that? What was she singing about? What was going on in her mind? Kids have all those questions too. Midrash Agadah is the kind of Midrash that fills in the story gaps. And you can see a lot of Midrash Agadah represented here. All the rabbis, Breshit Rabbah, Bamidbar Rabbah, the one called Midrash Agadah, all of those, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, all of those are Midrash Agadah. And then there's something called Midrash Halacha, which fills in the gaps on legal details. I don't know if there are any children's books about that. I'd love to see someone try. We'll focus on Midrash Agadah for our story today, but when you see things like Sifra and Sifrei, those are Midrash Halacha. They're also answering questions, filling in gaps. It says something like, keep Shabbat. What does that even mean to keep Shabbat? How should we celebrate Shabbat? Should we light candles? Should we have challah? Should we have wine, grape juice, right? Those kinds of questions are also the stuff of Midrash. So again, you can go from any text on Sefaria to open up a Midrash. Talmud is also a great source of Midrashic stories. They're freestanding stories sometimes, and sometimes they're actually based around verses. And so if you click on, I'll do that again because I wasn't narrating it. Again, if you click on the verse and you see everything in the sidebar, you can click on Midrash to open all the Midrashic text that Sefaria knows about, and you can click on Talmud to open the related passages. Again, anything you see in that sidebar is actually quoting the verse. And so once you get to a text that seems promising, seems interesting, seems like it might have the beginnings of a story, you can open up those Midrashim to get a sense of where to go next. Sefaria takes a little practice, takes a little time, but again, second graders can do it, so probably so can you. And with practice, for me, it takes practice to learn the apps that come naturally to my children. And I did put some resources on this sheet that will give you a broader introduction if you're interested, as well as my email, so you can feel free to follow up. You're muted, Catriella.
Yeah, this was just, I think a lot of authors here are just, their minds are blown because the access and the low barrier access that you're giving so many people to have inspiration and look at these stories is just phenomenal. When I was thinking about this before, I was thinking, so how does someone know which of these books are even about Midrash? And it's just really clear. And if you want to start with a story from Torah, you can, because then you can just easily see, where the story is expanded. So, amazing work that Sefaria is doing. And I have a feeling you're going to get a lot of an uptick in hits in the next couple of hours. So that's amazing. So we have some questions, and so let's bring Matt and Steve back with Sara, just highlight them here, because I think some of these questions are going to be things that our authors are going to want to. So someone asked, I love Jewish folktales, I happen to love golems, but I'm uncertain about how to share Jewish stories without either writing completely new stories that are not necessarily folktales anymore, writing something that is too close to copying. And so I think that Matt and Steve actually have really good examples of how you can take a story. First of all, the rabbis never copyrighted their work, so we're good. But where you can take a story and you can just use your imagination as and create a whole new plot that's your jumping board to a different world. And so my advice to authors when it comes to this kind of question, and I would be really interested to hear what Matt and Steve think about it, is first and foremost, think about who do you want to be reading this story, right? Because as a Jewish book program, if we really wanted everyone to know all the Jewish stories that there are and to know what those stories were, we would just send them to Sefaria, right? But we're sending you to Sefaria because we want you to think about who is your audience, who do you imagine picking up your book and reading it. And so once you know that, how do you engage them? Think of it from their point of view. How do you engage them in that story? So Steve, do you have anything to add to that from your own experience with Rabbi Harvey?
That was a big part of my experience, but not writing for anyone specific except for myself, which is really the best thing you can do. Is picture yourself at that whatever age you're trying to write for. But the other thing is just bring your own experience, because that's what's going to make your story unique. So for me, I was just, it happened very naturally as a kid. I was obsessed with these Jewish stories that we talked about, but also particularly Wild West stories, buried treasure stories, things that took place in this mythical Wild West. And those just very naturally mixed in my head. And so it wasn't so much of a leap to think of, well, I want to tell these Jewish stories, but that's been done a lot of times. What would I do that would be original? And it was, I'm going to make them Westerns. I'm just going to set them in this mountainous kind of Wild West of the 1870s that I picture in my imagination. And then I have something unique, something that's never been done. And I think everyone has that in them. It just depends on what their experience is and what they're really most interested in.
And I think it helped that you didn't enjoy Hebrew school, because you can identify with a lot of kids not wanting to learn in that traditional manner. and knowing that something was missing, and what was missing for you was what's probably missing for a lot of kids.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the first review, Harvey, when it first came out, didn't like get that much attention, but there was one review that had a great line that I still quote. It said, these stories are so much fun, you don't realize you're learning until it's too late. And that's sort of the mission of what I do in my day job too, writing nonfiction. And yeah, that's a big part of what I'm trying to do.
Golden. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Matt, how about you? How do you answer that question? How do you make stories accessible?
How do you make like accessible? Well, there was interesting. Two things, or maybe three. One of the questions was, how do you not copy, right? And how do you make it your own? And how do you, if you have to make it up also, right? So, this is our literature, right? So in a very deep sense, you don't, what you make up is your version of it, right? If you find the story, I'll just say that when I was looking for the stories, someone asked me like, how did you choose them? And the ones I chose, I was like, do I do it thematically? But it was really the ones that like punch me in the gut. I was like, what is this story? They call it the bottomless story, right? There's always something else to unpack, like the layers of the onion or something. The ones that I was like, it seems so simple on the surface, but the more you dig into it, the more you kind of look into it. You're like, what is this really about? And there is no answer. And so when I think about that, but also, when I think about making it my own, I'll show you an example right now. So, this is this story right here is called Before the Gate. This is a story by Franz Kafka. This is not Midrash in the traditional sense, although he lived in Prague, in the same town where the Maharal, Avram Lau, who was reportedly the guy who made the golem, not the Dough-lem, the golem, right? So even though he's a secular guy, he's steeped in Jewish tradition, right? And so the way he writes and how he writes very much reflects a Kabbalistic and Chassidut. Even though he was not of that world, it was imbued with him, right? So he couldn't help but write like that. So I made it my own in terms of like, what do the characters look like? There's this, the stories of this guy going to see the king, and there's a guard. So what does the guard look like? Okay, well, that's I was like, what if he was blue and had some weird, and I just want to also say, like, I wanted to put action to make it more readable. I got great advice, was that it had to be dangerous, right? Suspense. If you think about any opening to any movie, there's always a chase scene. You want to get the blood, the adrenaline going. So that's what I did. Even though Franz Kafka did not put any sort of chase scene in any of the story, I inserted a chase scene and made it as if this guy were dreaming about what would happen if he entered into the maze, which he never does in the original story. But I put it in there because I feel like I wanted it to like grab the readers more. Does it take away from the story? I think it actually adds to the story. This is my drosh on the story. And it actually helps out later. I'll if you read it, the actual entrance to the maze comes back, and what they find there comes back. So I feel like A, I found the story that kicked me in the gut. B, I made it my own, and C, I felt it malleable. Right? These stories, you could, the bones. They give you the bones, and it's your job to put the meat on it, as it were, and dress it up. That is your own expression. That's the only thing I would say is, if you read someone else's, Sarah and I talk about copyright. If you read someone else's story, don't use their words, because the translation of Midrash is different than using Midrash, right? That's when lawsuits start. And that's a real thing. That's a real thing. So I think it's worth noting.
Okay, that's really helpful. Both of you, those are really, really helpful words in terms of really making it your own and finding the things that really engage you to really go crazy with your imagination as well. And I feel like that relates to two other questions that we have, and I think we can kind of combine them in some ways. One of the questions is, when we use one of the texts as inspiration, how would it be best to give credit to its origination? In other words, how best to cite the source, especially if it's referred to in different ways? That's a really good question. And another question I think that's related in some ways, or at least the way I'm interpreting it, is one area I've gotten a bit of pushback about is that many times if it's a midrash, it sometimes will disagree with the shot level, the literal meaning on the surface of the text. When readers who are less familiar with midrash, especially non-Jews, hear what's in the midrash, they think it's wrong. Has anyone else experienced this, and what do you do with this? And does it affect the saleability of such stories to non-Jewish presses? So that has many layers to it, that question. But the thing that appeals to me about both those questions is you can always, especially when submitting a story to us, obviously within the publication process, if it goes to PJ Library, and even if it doesn't go to PJ Library, but it is published, you'll figure out the best way to either have an afterword or a forward or some sort of explanation of where the source is for this story. But PJ Library has a great way of dealing with stories that are midrashic that may not seem Jewish, right? Because a lot of midrashic stories don't specifically talk about Jewish practice, Jewish life. A lot of them are like folk tales and legends that, how do you make them in their core related to a Jewish topic? This is a great chance to actually throw in our frameworks into the chat, the PJ Library and the PJ Our Way framework, so that authors can get a sense of what we're looking for in a story. But one great thing that PJ Library does, and that you can really do with the picture book, and unfortunately I'm not in my home, so I don't have PJ Library books to pull up and show you, is they include flaps with the books. And so the flaps do a lot to help focus and frame the story as a essentially Jewish story, because the flap will talk about not just the source of the story and the fact that it's a traditional Jewish story, but that it's related to specific Jewish values, specific Jewish perspectives that can help families talk about that. In terms of the question about pshat, the literal meaning, at PJ Library and PJ Our Way, we consider these interpretations to be as Jewish and as part of the Jewish corpus as our literal meaning biblical texts. And in many ways, Midrash is an easier way, especially for younger kids, to tell biblical stories and to tell the values that Jews traditionally have seen in those biblical stories, so that you don't have to show David carrying a giant monster's gorged out head and blood coming from all parts of his head. For older kids, you can do that. But for younger kids and for families with younger children, you can talk about David's courage. You can base it on the Midrashim about David's ability to lead people and to get to that point where, although he seemed weak, he was actually quite strong. So you can use Midrash to kind of mollify those stories and take away the same values. And then when the kids get older, you can really show them all the graphic gore and be really fun with it. Sara, did you have anything to add to those questions?
Yes, thank you. I would say, I think it's a really interesting question about the copying, but also the concern of moving too far away so that people say, well, this doesn't even exist. I would just say that Midrash is a noun, right? It describes a body of literature, but like so many words in Hebrew, it comes from a verb. You could actually search Midrash on Sefaria. I recommend it and see what happens, but you can also search other versions of that word like darash and dresha. It's an activity. Lidrosh means to dive into something or to delve into something and see what comes out of it. And so my advice would be to think maybe not just about the story that the Midrash is telling, but think about the question that the Midrash is actually answering. So I'll give you an example of something that I put on the sheet. There's a character who shows up a few times in the Bible, in the Torah. Her name is Serach bat Asher. She doesn't do anything whatsoever in the Torah. And so it's a mystery why she's mentioned. Like, why is her name mentioned and why is it mentioned over the course of generations? The Midrash goes wild with this and has really very, I think, fascinating stories. Maybe the PJ Library team will tell me that there already are books about Sarah Bat Asher, but I could imagine several different stories. What the Midrash says is interesting. It casts her as a kind of memory keeper, a kind of holder of secrets, somebody who lived many generations beyond what she should have. But really the question is just, why is her name mentioned? Who is this mystery woman who keeps kind of showing up in a crowd? I think that's a really interesting question that you could ask in lots of different ways. And if somebody came up with an answer that was different than what the Midrash itself actually said, I would say that would be an act of Midrash, and something that could be a really interesting beginning of a story.
That's great. Yeah, I've always been, you inspired me. It's like those, she's a character that's always kind of ignited imagination. So too Elijah, because Elijah obviously shows up, but his the number of times he's cited in Midrash goes way beyond his role in the actual biblical stories that he's involved with, and takes on all sorts of new personas.
Can I just add on to what Sarah was saying and just say it explicitly? I think that she brings up a good point. I think as creators, we have to understand that Midrash is not while we consider it something that was, the act of lidrosh, of interpreting, is an ongoing activity and actually is central to who we are. We have the core stories and we are constantly droshing on them, and it could be like momentarily. And I think each one of our books is the continuation of that tradition. And I think that is part of our mission, right? To make it relevant for us and to pass it on for the next generation. So they're going to make this into an immersive, Oculus video game, or whatever, that will be the next iteration when you're actually, I have this theory that like the third temple will be done virtually, some sort of taking where we're at and pushing it forward.
Totally. So we have a more practical question, Sarah. How often is Sefaria updated?
I'm not sure what that means by updated.
I guess how many times does it, are more sources added? Are things, corrected?
Sources are constantly being added. You can, I think I put a link on the sheet. Definitely there's an email address. You can sign up for our emails and you'll get updates that go out. Also, you can follow our social media, but yeah, we're constantly adding text. So basically daily. Some of those texts are in Hebrew and some of them are in English. And because of copyright issues, the English texts are the harder ones to get. But we're always adding text, we're always adding things. We have around 460,000 unique users a month on our site. And some smaller percentage of those people are generating materials. So in addition to the text that we're adding, we have a few 100,000 user-generated materials on Sefaria, and people are literally creating those materials every day. So any day that you go on, Sefaria won't necessarily look exactly as it did the day before, at least in terms of the links that are being generated, which is a whole other kind of content creation that our engineers are working on, as well as the user-generated content that's constantly being added.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for explaining that. It's so dynamic and incredible, what your team is accomplishing. So we have a couple of questions that relate to women. And this goes back to the question about tweens and making a story more comfortable, but this is about female characters. One person asked, any ideas about how to bring in a more female perspective? And another person asked, in storytelling, I'm envisioning women where there are none. Is this kosher to write about? And I'll answer quickly and say, just put the women in. We've seen a lot of stories where the perspective has changed, and you can play with that. And just like Steve and Matt have played with their stories, you can also add modern characters who are looking at it from a different perspective. Matt and Steve, do you have anything to add to that?
That's definitely something that I thought about a lot. And it's very easy when I was redoing my versions of stories, it's very easy to add kids who are girls. But I also wanted a female main character. And so I just came up with, and this is purely artistic
Abby.
license. I came up with this woman, Abigail, who would be come to town to maybe she was a failed gold miner, basically, which worked really well for a particular story that I was writing. And then I thought, well, why not just have her stay in town and become a teacher, which is a perfectly realistic job a woman would have had in this setting of Colorado and on the frontier. But also then she could become a recurring character in future stories. And then you are allowed, certainly, I think, when you're retelling stories, to assign a certain key moment to a character you've created. I think that's totally in bounds. And it actually allowed me to do lots of cool things to kind of create. I was not going to go down like the romance road for this audience. It didn't make sense. So it was very clear from the start that there was a little something between Harvey and Abigail. So I sort of played with that a little bit, but it was more just like a friend. He really needed a friend and companion, and she became a really important character as the stories went on.
So we actually, before we get to Matt, we only have a few minutes left, and the technical difficulties that Steve had before in sharing his PowerPoint have actually been solved. So Steve, do you want to take a couple of minutes? I'll share my screen and you can kind of go through the Rabbi Harvey process a little bit with the authors who are here. You're muted.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I'll be really, really quick about it. So you'll just put them on the screen and I'll say next. Yeah, all right. Just start on Harvey there. That's just kind of a hipster Harvey there with his plaid shirt. But if you just go through them quickly, that first one of the kids, that's me and my brother. That's the day of my bar mitzvah, actually. So we're all dressed up. And that's
so 1 second, I'm going to just do it like this.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's good. Yeah, there's the old bar mitzvah picture. I'm the curly haired guy, obviously. And that's really where this story comes from. We wanted to be brother filmmakers, and we always wrote comics and screenplays together. But the next one is the book. Anyone recognize that? I wish I could see you guys out there. Is there anyone saying, oh yeah, I had that. I remember that. You got to admit, that's not as exciting as a book about baseball or sharks or something, but it was really influential to me. So yeah, just go through them really quickly and I'll get to the process ones. Just going back to that other one. Go back to the one right before that. So I had that book, but I also had these kind of books in my room. And that's where I say that everyone has some kind of original perspective. And someone just wrote a note saying they still have it. That's what I think. This is my light bulb moment, was just not physically holding them, but in my mind holding these two books. And I think everyone has some kind of unique combination like that. If you go to the next one, the research was really important. Pioneer Jews, so it's not a joke. There really were Jews in the Wild West. And so when I started doing research, and this is just basic stuff in a library, I found out all these great sources. Here are people who are Western mayors, Jewish mayors of Western towns like Deadwood and Butte, Montana. I mean, like really tough places. So that's great. And also the visuals, the facial hair of those guys. And these are the books I found, but these are the books that any of you guys would find in a library starting doing the research. Again, there's so much more available, especially with what Sarah's doing. I would have loved that. And if I hopefully get to continue these books, I'll use that for sure. So this is just the process stuff. I write it just like a screenplay. So I just take the stories I want to tell and write it out as a script. And the next 2 pages, I think, are just, drawing it out like a pencil drawing and then a pen. Collecting visual references is really fun from old Westerns. There's Harvey looking like John Wayne, but not quite. The pants don't quite fit as well. It was fun to me bringing in wisdom beyond the Talmud. As Harvey likes to say, any fool can criticize and complain, and most do, which is a great line. And this other rabbi thinks it's from the Talmud, but it's actually from Ben Franklin. And I love that. I just love mixing and matching those kinds of bits of wisdom wherever they're from. Yeah, we can get to that. If we want to draw Harvey, we can get to that later. But I do this in schools all the time with kids. And this too is just my point. Even if you give people the steps, they will all draw Harvey in a unique way. And I think that's the beauty of these Jewish folktales. Everyone will retell them in a unique way. So there's my daughter when the book came out. Yeah, we can stop there for now, and let's hear what Matt had to say about the previous question.
What are we talking about? Sorry, we're talking about women's voices, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to say two things. Number one, once again, the adaptation. This was once again another very popular called Under the Bridge, and I've heard it told many ways in many different cultures actually. It's The Alchemist is the base of the story from and so I was like, this is based on I was like, let's make it an adventure. When I pictured who was going to read this book, it was my two daughters, who are now 14 and 12, but at the time they were 8 and 6. So I was like, I made a strong female protagonist, like a hero, one of the story, one of the heroes, and then also a few characters. But I also want to address, and I'm not actually trying to plug anything, but the next book that I'm working on right now is about Bibical of Hamelin, who is a 17th century Jewess. And what's amazing about her is she is a storyteller, and her whole book is stories about her life, but she also brings in Midrash. And it's super fascinating to adapt a story about a woman living in Germany in the 17th century who brings the same wisdom and is kind of passing it on to her kids. So so when I think about how to interpret the stories into art, then it is it's that frame of mind. How would she think about these stories? How would she think about the women in the stories? Like, what is their role and what is her role? So that's a really fascinating. And by the way, someone put in the front, it's Gluckel. Gluckel is the German, but Glickle is the Yiddish. So.
Oh, good.
Stick with Glickle.
So that's a great plug. And since we're coming to the end of our time, I wanted to put in another plug, which is that Matt and I have been, Matt disappeared, but he is interested in this. Matt and I have been talking, very good. Matt and I have been talking about creating a Midrash workshop, a kind of series of opportunities for authors to delve deeper into Midrash. We want to include Sefaria on that too, using texts that we can all find. And kind of, if we come up with a core group of authors who really want to go in deep, please let us know if you're interested. You don't have to let us know in the chat. You can write
Looks like there's
at one of, that's right, we do have interest. So write to us. A lot of you know how to reach us. You can also just come to submissions@pjrway.org or submissions@pjlibrary.org and just let us know, and we'll start to work on a series like that. But right now we've come to the end of our hour, and I really want to thank our panelists today, Matt, Steve, Sara. You've introduced so many fascinating ideas of how we can delve deeper into text and how we can use it as a starting point to really come up with imaginative and engaging stories for kids and for families. So this has been really fascinating. I want to give a really big shout out to Tasha Flagg and Rachel Goodman, who are on the back end answering questions and dealing with the tech. And a major shout out to Emily Brown, who's also on the back end today, but has organized this series of author webinars. We started with authors. We had another one about PJ Library, another one about PJ Arway, and we ended with authors and resources. So it was a great way to end this series. We hope to offer more series. If you have any interesting ideas for what you'd like to hear about and what you'd like to go more in depth on, please let us know. And that's it for today. Thank you everybody for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your summer. And we can't wait to get those Midrash stories.